Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. This channel explores critical issues in the world. This presentation is titled Why African Countries Are Not Independent States. The presentation is motivated by the fact that after more than 40 or 60 years of the so-called independence, African countries continue to operate as if they are colonies, and the rulers behave as if they are heads of colonial nations rather than sovereign states. The purpose of the presentation is to accomplish four goals. 1. Examine the four conditions stipulated in the Montevideo Convention of December 26, 1933, that political communities must meet to gain independence. 2. Apply the four conditions of the Montevideo Convention of International Law to determine whether African countries meet the conditions or not. 3. Explore the operational structures of African government institutions with the aim of determining whether they are compatible with the notion of independence. And 4. Examine the behavior of African rulers with the aim of determining whether such behaviors reinforce the notion of sovereignty or not. This is the map of Africa showing the different regions of the continent. Although almost all modern African nations are regarded as sovereign states after supposedly gaining political independence from their European colonial masters and are recognized as such under international law, it is argued here that they are not. Instead, they are more appropriate to be referred to as semi-autonomous nations or political communities. It might be necessary to briefly look at the African situation. Today, Africa has about 54 countries that are generally regarded as independent sovereign states. As a result, they are members of the United Nations and other major international and regional organizations. Due to being regarded as sovereign states, they exchange diplomatic relations with other sovereign states in the world. This is the map of Africa showing the different countries in different colors. Despite the international recognition as sovereign states, a heart-wrenching question about the fundamental nature of African states keeps coming up in public discourse. The question is, are African nations truly sovereign states? To answer this question effectively, it is necessary to comprehend the conditions or characteristics in international law that necessitate the granting of independence or the acquisition of statehood by any group of people or political community that seeks political independence. Now let's look at the four conditions of the Montevideo Convention. They are that any community or political group that is seeking independence to become a sovereign state must meet the following four conditions or requirements. 1. Have an indigenous population. 2. Have a defined territory. 3. Have an autonomous government. 4. Have the ability to establish relations with other sovereign states. Now, let's look at the first condition, that is, have an indigenous population. The first requirement for any political community or nation that desire to gain independence must meet is to have an indigenous population. On the surface, it appears that modern African states met the conditions or characteristics of the indigenous population requirement during the colonial era. However, the population situation is much more complex than indicated above. The indigenous African ethnic nationalities were not active participants, and neither did they make any conscious effort to be located in the colonies that are now regarded as independent states. This is the map of Africa showing the different linguistic groups. There is no evidence to show that the colonial authorities conducted plebiscites or referenda or opinion polls to determine the views of the indigenous populations prior to creating the colonies and the subsequent granting of independence. Indeed, it is arguable that not a single indigenous ethnic group consciously accepted to be placed in Kenya or Burkina Faso or Libya or Algeria or Zambia or Nigeria or Ghana or Mali or Senegal or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They were forced at gunpoint to become the colonial subjects of the colonies in which they found themselves. The exception will be the English-speaking Cameroon, which through referendum joined Cameroon from Nigeria after the Second World War. The colonial powers simply used force to create the colonies based on their strategic interests without the consent of the indigenous ethnic nationalities which occupy various sections of the territories that subsequently became colonies. Thus, the Belgians, British, French, German, Portuguese, and Spanish authorities imposed the colonies upon the ethnic groups they conquered and forced them to identify with the new arrangements as the basis of their citizenship. One of the unfortunate byproducts of forced citizenship is that some ethnic nationalities that were historically antagonistic to each other were forced to become part of the same colonies. In countries where such historical hostilities existed, tension is always high due to mutual suspicion that one ethnic group is trying to have an advantage over the other. Another evidence of the incompatibility of the colonial populations is the fact that the European powers even amalgamated groups that had different religious orientations. Some of the countries that are experiencing pain due to the merging of Islamic, ancestralist, and Christian groups include Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Ethiopia, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mozambique, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, countries like South Africa and Tanzania and so forth are merely religious time bombs waiting to explode in the future, even though they are currently enjoying religious coexistence and peacefulness. Countries like Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, and so on and so forth face Islamic militants who are waging wars to Islamize them and the African continent. As indicated above, due to the arbitrary way the colonies were created by the European powers, almost every modern African state has a multi-ethnic population. This means that most states have several ethnic groups. So, for instance, Angola has over 100 ethnic groups. Cameroon has more than 240 ethnic groups. Democratic Republic of the Congo has over 250 ethnic groups. Egypt has 5 ethnic groups. Ethiopia has more than 80 ethnic groups. Ghana has about 80 to 100 ethnic groups. Kenya about 26 ethnic groups. Libya has about 20 ethnic groups. Mali has about 12 ethnic groups. Morocco has about 5 ethnic groups. Mozambique about 13 ethnic groups. Senegal has about 20 ethnic groups. Tanzania has about 100 ethnic groups. And Zimbabwe has about 4 ethnic groups, with the Shona and the Ndebele being the most dominant. In other words, the indigenous populations that constitute modern African states did not voluntarily, under any democratic arrangement, conceded or surrender their sovereignty to become part of the states that now exist in the continent. Now, let's look at condition number 2. A second condition or characteristics that a group or nation that wishes to gain independence and become a sovereign state must meet is that it must have a defined territory. It is doubtful whether most of the African colonies met this condition before they were granted independence. It is argued here that they did not meet the conditions for a defined territory before the colonial powers granted them independence. The reason is that almost all modern African countries have arbitrary territorial boundaries that do not reflect the ethnic compositions of various groups in the continent. For example, ethnically speaking, Yoruba territory extends from Nigeria to probably Republic of Togo. The Berbers are in Algeria, Burkina Faso, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Morocco, Niger, and Tunisia. The Afar people are in Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. The Akan people are in Ghana and Ivory Coast. The Fulanis are found in over 10 African countries. The Azande people are found in South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic. The Chiwa people are in Malawi and Zambia. Similarly, the Mandingo people, who are also referred to as the Malinke and Mandinka, are found in Burkina Faso, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. The Oromo people are in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti. The Tuaregs are found in Algeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Like the Fulani, the Hausas are found in Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and so forth. The arbitrariness of the territorial boundaries means that most of these states can never be stable. It also means that the African continent can never experience peace, since the ethnic groups that are scattered into different countries will not stop visiting their blood relatives, regardless of wherever they may be. Each time they do so, they violate the immigration laws of some of the artificially created states. It also means that if one of the ethnic groups that are scattered into two or more countries gets involved in conflict with the state or another ethnic group, there is a potential that the conflict is likely to spread across territorial boundaries. That was exactly what happened to the Liberian, Ivory Coast, and Sierra Leonean conflicts because the ethnic groups are intertwined. Apart from the scattering of some ethnic groups into many states, another facet of the arbitrariness of the territories of the African states is that some countries have a territorial divide based on religion. Thus, in some countries, the northern half is Islamized, while the southern half is Christianized. This creates a double-headed political monster that drags many states downward. The northern and southern portions or regions do not see things through the same political wavelength. Each region is fearful of being dominated and marginalized by the other. This leads to constant power struggles which eventually result in military coups and rebellions. In fact, many African countries have experienced territorial disputes pitting the Islamized regions against the ancestralized and Christianized regions. Some countries that are bedecked by the territorial divide based on religion are Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, Gambia, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, and so forth. As a result of the territorial divide based on religion, some of these countries have fought bloody civil wars based on religious animosities. The territorial spread of the ethnic groups makes the idea of border control impossible for the European colonies that now claim to be sovereign states. In other words, most African states cannot practically enforce the territorial integrity of their borders. The reason is that the ethnic groups are spread across artificial colonial boundaries. Evidently, any attempt to enforce the territorial borders would seriously violate the rights of some ethnic nationalities, and that can lead to conflict. Now, let's look at the third requirement for a political community to gain independence. The third condition or characteristic that any political community or nation must meet in order to achieve political independence and become a sovereign state is that the group must possess an autonomous government. This requires those seeking independence to have a government in place that is accepted by the majority of the people. If this condition is applied to the colonial entities in Africa prior to independence, it is obvious that the colonies did not meet this condition before they were granted independence. It is necessary to elaborate on the position by examining the political circumstances prior to colonization, during colonization, and after supposed independence. Before the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, the African people operated two kinds of state systems. Some ethnic groups had states and others were stateless. The ethnic groups that operated states eventually metamorphosed into powerful conquering states such as the Ashanti, Ajuran, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Oyo, Benin, Mutapa, and Kabu empires. The Muslims too also established their own political states like the Mount, Adal, Wasangale, Sokoto, and other sultanates. Some ethnic groups became powerful kingdoms such as the Inri, Bolo, Lunda, Jonkun, Hausa, Bao, Kayo, Congo, Zimbabwe, and so forth. The ethnic groups that were not conquering states were generally considered as stateless since they were structurally decentralized politically into subgroups. The stateless states were often victimized by the conquering states which were highly centralized. The stateless states were less politically structured and were not militaristic, and neither were they imperialistic. Regardless of whether they were centralized or decentralized, or were states or stateless, they all had governments that were accepted by the people since the governments originated from their ancestors and reflected their political, cultural, and religious existence. Thus, political and religious authorities were well established, and the people accepted the arrangements as legitimate political authorities. After successfully conquering the pre-colonial African states, the Belgians, British, French, Germans, Portuguese, and Spanish established the colonies, primarily to exploit their natural resources and at the same time extend their hegemonic control of various parts of the world. The colonial powers then established governments to run the colonies. Apparently, the colonial governments were imposed by the European powers without the consent of the indigenous people who owned the territories, since the colonies were arbitrarily established by the conquering powers. The indigenous Africans had no input in the affairs of the colonies. The colonial authorities made all the decisions, and the indigents simply followed along or were compelled to follow along. In some cases, the colonial authorities tried to indigenize the colonial governments by co-opting some traditional leaders and administrators through indirect rule to serve as leaders under the supervision of the colonial authorities. The earliest indigenous individuals who fought against foreign colonization were the traditional African leaders, that is, the kings, queens, and chiefs were the first African leaders to fight against the European colonial effort. Some of the wars which reflected indigenous opposition to colonialism included the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, which lasted from 1824 to 1901, the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, the Gun War of 1880 to 1881, the Battle of Adwa, which took place March 1, 1896 in Ethiopia, the South African War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902, the Somali Land Campaign, also known as the Anglo-Somali War of 1900 to 1920, the Congo Wara Rebellion, also known as the War of the Ho, which lasted from 1928 to 1931. These were some of the wars that the traditional leaders fought to resist European colonialism. The traditional nationalists were later replaced in the anti-colonial struggle by westernized and Islamized indigenous political elites who had been educated and socialized to embrace Islam, Christianity, and secular humanism through formal educational institutions which were initially started by Islamic and Christian missionaries. A third tier of the elements who fought to take over from the colonial powers were the armed liberation fighters. In fact, Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe had a serious conflict, and the revolutionary fighters like Robert Mugabe, like Samuel Najumo of Namibia, and all the rest of them fought militarily to gain independence. Consequently, when the African colonies supposedly gained independence, the African elites who took over simply replaced the colonialists and continued to rule like colonial overlords. The ethnic groups that were splintered or scattered continued to remain scattered. The ethnic groups and regions that gained the favor of the colonial authorities continued to maintain their superior political positions vis-a-vis the other ethnic groups and regions. Evidently, the ethnic groups that were marginalized during the colonial era continued to suffer marginalization after the supposed independence of the African colonies. The colonies were given independence without proper consultation with the ethnic nationalities as to whether they wanted to remain in the new states or not. Since the colonies were arbitrarily created and the colonial authorities merely handed over the colonies without adjusting the boundaries or the composition of the ethnic groups, it means that the governments were not legitimate in the eyes of the people. Now, let's look at the requirement number 4, which says that a political community that wants to gain independence must have the ability to establish relations with other sovereign states. Although this requirement is always the most difficult to meet due to the fact that sovereign states generally consider their strategic interests in deciding whether to recognize a political community or not. It is of the view that the African nationalists who fought for independence were able to meet this requirement, since the mood of the global community was to grant self-determination to all colonies, following the end of the most brutal and destructive Second World War, which claimed about 60 million lives. Moreover, those African elites who fought for independence joined the non-aligned movement, thereby establishing cordial relationships with both sovereign states and other nations that sought independence. Additionally, the political atmosphere in the United Nations favored granting of independence. This facilitated the establishment of relations with many sovereign states that supported decolonization, and that is why many African countries gained independence. Apart from examining the 4 conditions stipulated by the Montevideo Convention of 1933, the fact that African rulers have failed to restructure the countries to reflect African cultural beliefs, values, and practices in running the governments and the institutions of government indicate that they are not sovereign states. It is necessary to pinpoint the failures. Okay? A visit to Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe is like a visit to Great Britain. Despite supposedly gaining independence, they have governments based on secular humanism with police and military forces and administrative and judicial systems that are carbon copies of the British system. So you feel like you are in Britain even though you are in Africa. A visit to Algeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Mali, Morocco, Niger, Senegal, and Tunisia is like a visit to France and probably Belgium. The reason is that they have governments based on secular humanism with police and military forces and administrative and judicial systems that are carbon copies of the French system. Even the political parties are operated as if they are French political parties. Judges and lawyers wear wigs in most English and French-speaking countries in Africa as if they are practicing law in Europe. A visit to Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique clearly creates the impression that one is in Portugal because they copied the Portuguese, even though they fought liberation wars to free themselves from Portuguese colonialism. Of course, these countries operated initially as socialist countries, but you can sense Portugal all around them. A visit to most countries in North and West Africa, including Algeria, Burkina Faso, Chad, Egypt, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Morocco, Niger, Islamic Northern Nigeria, Somalia, Zanzibar, and so forth, creates the impression that one is in Saudi Arabia or one of the Arab countries in the Middle East. African educational institutions are a continuation of the colonial systems that the Muslim and Christian missionaries imposed and sanctioned by the colonial authorities. The curricula of the educational systems were designed to reinforce Arabism, Islamism, and European and Christianity, and denigrate African religions and cultures. As a result, African students graduate from secondary school and university with little or no knowledge of their African cultural heritage, but they can quote the Bible and the Quran in a twinkling of an eye as if they wrote the two sacred books. That tells you the nature of the African educational system in independent Africa. Due to the colonially oriented educational systems, almost all educated sub-Saharan Africans claim to be either Christians or Muslims. They ignore the fact that these two religions were imposed greatly through military conquest and colonization. Almost all African rulers claim to be either Christians or Muslims. Of course, they are all products of the colonial educational systems which denigrated their cultures, religions, and history. The only exception might be the Republic of Benin, which does not shy away from promoting African traditional religions. If anyone visits a courtroom in Africa, he or she is going to feel like being in a courtroom in Europe or Arabia because the legal systems are totally alien to the African cultural environment. To show their legal prowess, African lawyers enjoy quoting Latin and the Quran to demonstrate their skills in emulating the Arabs and the Europeans. The lawyers and judges practice foreign laws in countries where most of the people have never visited these foreign places before. Generally, due to the semi-autonomous nature of African countries, government institutions are designed to serve the head of state and the ruling elite rather than the state. Quite often, regardless of constitutional stipulations, those who serve as the heads of the army, police, air force, intelligence, immigration, national banks, and other government institutions bend the rules incessantly to make sure that the interests of the ruler and his family prevail at the disadvantage of the citizens and of the national interest. As a result, almost all elections in Africa are rigged to favor the ruler and those who wield power. Opposition candidates are harassed constantly to destabilize them and their political parties so that they will not mobilize sufficiently to threaten the stranglehold that the ruling elite has over the nation. Quite often, opposition political leaders are charged with treason and terrorism just to have them detained or imprisoned unnecessarily to prevent them from challenging the authority of the rulers. Although African rulers often deploy security and intelligence agencies against the opposition and those who are regarded as troublemakers, in reality, it is the rulers who are the primary violators of the national security of their countries. So let's see how the anti-national behavior of the African rulers threaten the sovereignty of the African states. The following provides the numerous ways in which African rulers and their surrogates are responsible for emasculating the sovereignty of African nations. Most African rulers do not pay much respect to the constitutions of their countries. They tend to assume that they are above the constitution and the laws, hence they can do as they wish. Many African rulers ignore constitutional limitations and remain in power endlessly as if they are monarchs. They do so by compelling the legislative branches of government to amend the constitutions to allow them to run for political office repeatedly. The next page shows the list of leaders who have ruled and are ruling endlessly. Some current and former African rulers in the modern era that ruled for 2 or more decades are Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, ruled for 33 years, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania ruled for 21 years, Leopold Senghor of Senegal ruled for 20 years, Hastings Banda of Malawi ruled for 30 years, Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of the Congo ruled for 32 years, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya ruled for 42 years, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia ruled for 27 years, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbazoko of Equatorial Guinea ruled and continues to rule for 43 years, Denis Sassou Nguesso of the Republic of Congo ruled for 36 years, Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe ruled for 30 years, Zen El Abidine Ben Ali of Tunisia ruled for 22 years, Paul Biya of Cameroon has ruled for 40 years, Museveni of Uganda has ruled for 36 years and is still in power, Gnassingbé Eyadema of Togo ruled for 24 years, Idriss Deby of Chad ruled for 30 years, Paul Kagame of Rwanda is ruling for 22 years. Hosni Mubarak of Egypt ruled for 30 years. Many African rulers pretend to be democrats while running for office, but as soon as they get into power, they become authoritarian by discouraging constructive criticism. They send the security forces to clamp down on the opposition and whoever speaks negatively about them. They simply use elections to legalize their leadership and care little about democracy and the rule of law. The heads of the security services, that is the police, army, navy, air force, intelligence, and other security services spend more time working to protect the ruling elite instead of the state. They do whatever they are told by the rulers, regardless of the constitutionality of the order, against the general interest of the citizens and the nations. They do so in order to retain their positions. This contributes to the abuse of human rights in Africa today. When an African ruler and some members of the elite are involved in corruption cases, the tendency of the law enforcement agencies is to intimidate witnesses and the citizens to stop talking about the cases or issue while the cases are squashed to protect those involved because they are the ruling elite. Almost all African rulers and the political elite have foreign bank accounts. This means that they do not have faith in the banks in their own countries. The behavior threatens the national security of their own nations. Almost all African heads of states and members of the ruling elite receive medical services overseas. This means that they do not have faith in their own countries. It also means that they do not care about the national security of their own countries. Most African rulers send their children to attend universities overseas. This means that they do not have faith in their own educational systems. They do not realize that sending children of the ruling elite overseas is a threat to the national security of their countries. African rulers have not figured a way to utilize their citizens for the industrial development of their countries, so they rely heavily on foreign countries and multinational companies to assist them. And that makes them look like beggars. They tend to treat foreign consultants more than their own professionals, hence award massive contracts for the extraction of the natural resources of their countries to foreign companies. The multinational corporations are allowed by African rulers to exploit the continent. By so doing, the ruling elite get richer and the masses get poorer. In 2014, a report indicated that multinational corporations siphoned off about $46 billion, while about $35 billion were taken out of Africa into tax havens. Many African rulers signed bilateral and multilateral treaties that give away critical minerals of their countries to foreign countries and companies. There are many examples to cite from. Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zimbabwe, and so forth allow foreign companies to mine gold instead of encouraging their citizens to do so in order to boost the domestic economy. Ghana signed a treaty with the European Union to flood the country with tomato products, thereby destroying the local tomato industry. Senegal and other African countries signed treaties with the European Union to allow European fishing companies to fish around their territorial waters, thereby depriving local fishermen and women of the ability to fish and contribute to their economies. Nigeria depends on the oil companies to tell it the quantity of oil it produces daily. Moreover, most of the oil wealth ends in the pockets of high government officials and private oil stock owners. This is why even though Africa is one of the richest continents in the world, it is probably the poorest because African rulers do not seem to value their countries. Africa's ruling elite is responsible for massively looting the financial resources of their countries and depositing the funds in foreign countries. The foreign countries use the African funds to invest in their own countries to create jobs for their citizens while the African people remain in abject poverty. Transparency International noted, Africa is the world's second fastest growing region, and yet 100 million Africans live in extreme poverty today compared to the 1990s. Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, is home to the largest share of people living in extreme poverty. Some analysts estimate that about $50 billion is looted out of Africa every year. It is mostly government officials who are responsible for the massive looting. Likewise, it was estimated around 2012 that more than $700 billion left sub-Saharan Africa since 1970. During the same time, the total African debt was about $175 billion. Capgemini and Merrill Lynch estimated that about 100,000 Africans have a total of 1.2 trillion of liquid wealth, while the generality of the African people is poor. If these public officials really believe that their countries are independent states, would they be behaving the way they do? Thus, the Congo Basin is one of the richest parts of the world, yet the Democratic Republic of the Congo rulers do not know what to do with the vast wealth apart from giving it away in return for 5 or 10%. Thus, the African ruling elite could be viewed as internal colonialists. They simply replace the external colonialists and are doing an excellent job of decimating their countries financially. If African countries were independent states, their rulers would not have been behaving like students in the sense that one foreign country would invite all African heads of state to a meeting and they would rush to attend. For instance, it is not unusual for the United States, Russia, and China to invite all African heads of state to a meeting that generally benefits the strategic interests of the countries which invited them. In such conferences, you have one head of state of a sovereign country inviting over 40 African heads of state. Generally, most African rulers tend to focus excessively on foreign aid and expect donor countries to assist them to develop instead of marshalling their citizens to engage in self-development. Hence, they are very beggarly and are not respected in the Committee of Nations. No wonder President Putin of Russia noted, and I quote, Africa will never be independent. Africans believe in Europeans, Americans, and the Chinese more than themselves. Conclusion. In critically examining the 4 conditions necessary for attaining diplomatic recognition, it appears that the African colonies did not meet or satisfy 3 of the 4 conditions. They did not meet the condition of having a population since the colonies were established without the approval of the ethnic groups that constituted them. The former colonies did not meet the territorial requirement for statehood because the territories were arbitrarily established by the colonial powers. Hence, many ethnic groups are scattered into different countries, thereby violating their nationality. The colonies did not meet conditions 1 through 3, which require a political community to have an autonomous government. The reason is that the indigenous political leaders or nationalists who took over from the European colonialists were simply handed over colonial entities that had been conquered through wars of aggression without any territorial or political adjustments to ensure compatibility with the African cultural beliefs and practices. The colonies, it appears, only met condition number 4, which requires an ability to establish relations with other sovereign states. The reason is that the African political activists who fought for independence were able to meet this condition since they joined the non-aligned movement and were in a friendly relationship with the communist and socialist countries which supported independence for them. Moreover, after the Second World War, there was a global movement to grant independence to all colonial territories. That allowed the African colonies to gain independence without necessarily meeting the 4 conditions. The fact that African countries have not instituted substantive structural reforms to change the colonial system in terms of the territorial boundaries and the rearranging of the entities through plebiscites and referenda shows that the African countries continue to operate as colonial entities. The fact that governmental institutions are operated as if they are either European or Arabian countries indicates that they continue to maintain colonial systems despite claiming to be independent. The fact that the educational systems in the continent continue to produce school graduates based largely on European and Arabian curricula indicates that the colonial systems remains intact. The fact that most Africans strongly identify with Christianity and Islam, even though these religions came to the continent as part of the conquering and colonial projects, indicates that religious independence has not taken place. The fact that most African rulers identify themselves as Christians and Muslims indicates that their countries are not independent. The realization that most African rulers have foreign bank accounts, receive medical services overseas, and send their children to school overseas indicates that they do not believe in their countries. The fact that the African ruling elite is primarily engaged in the massive looting of the wealth of their countries shows that they do not believe that their countries are sovereign states. Thus, the artificially created African countries require restructuring. Otherwise, they will remain very unstable. It is not surprising that almost all the countries that were regarded as bastions of democracy and stability, including Ivory Coast, Kenya, Cameroon, Mali, Senegal, and so forth, have experienced political crisis. Due to artificiality, any African country can implode at any time due to the political fragility of the political and structural foundations. Hence, it is not surprising that all of a sudden Sudan is in a state of war, while in Senegal you have riots. Despite the grim prognosis, there is a glimmer of hope for a better Africa. Gradually, African rulers are beginning to speak like leaders to defend their cultural and their geopolitical interests of Africa. The credit goes to President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and President William Ruto of Kenya. However, President Museveni and President Kagame must shake off their ruler for life view of leadership. In particular, Kenya's President Ruto seems to be a potential African leader who is likely to encourage new thinking in African affairs. There is a possibility that the present state system might be scrapped for a more representative continental system, as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana had suggested. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please subscribe to the channel to view other interesting presentations. Again, thank you.